Welcome back to our four-part series on culture. This is part 2. We are going to discuss some more features of culture. In culture part 1, we talked about how we define it and introduced the topic of culture. Now we will kind of break it down a little bit further and discuss some other features of culture. So I have been mentioning that culture is learned, symbolic, and shared. So one of the most important aspects of culture is that it is learned. Interestingly, humans are not the only animals that have culture. Other species, especially some mammals, do share and transmit knowledge amongst each other. It's not based on instinct, it's based on learning. And then that gets shared again through the generations. That does occur in nature outside of human culture. But one interesting thing that makes humans different is that in human enculturation, which is the process by which culture is learned and shared and transmitted across the generations, depends upon the developed human capacity to use symbols. So that is one big difference in human culture, is that we use symbols. Symbols are defined as signs that have no natural or necessary connection to the things they represent. In fact, Clifford Geertz defined culture as ideas based on cultural learning and symbols. Again, culture is learned. Every person begins immediately through a process of conscious and unconscious learning and interaction with others to internalize or incorporate a cultural tradition through the process of enculturation, which that was kind of a complicated way of saying that from the minute we're born, we're learning and we're absorbing what's happening around us and learning usually first from our parents. And we're not just learning how to survive on the day-to-day, how to get what we want, how to request what we need from our parents. We're learning our culture as well. So sometimes culture is taught directly, and our parents, of course, teach us lots of lessons along the way throughout our childhood, but it's also transmitted through observation. And think about how many times your parents have told you to do one thing, but then you witness them doing the exact opposite. So that's just one example of the different ways we learn our culture. The current consensus in anthropology is that culture is uniquely expressed in humans and that all humans have culture. So we have a unique type of culture and we all have a culture. I would argue that if a person has grown up in isolation, well, they would probably not live very long. They wouldn't have culture. You have to get it from other people. But here I think the argument is that all human societies have culture. That would be a better way to say it. Anthropologists also accept that all human populations have the same capacities for culture. So regardless of a person's genes or their physical appearance, people can learn any cultural tradition. So what this statement is basically saying is that there are no societies with less culture, or there are no societies that are uncultured. We all have the same capacities for culture. And you'll see that running as a theme throughout this class is that we examine each culture across the globe as just as complex as the next culture. Okay, we talked about this a little bit already, but culture is learned and it's also symbolic. So anthropologist Leslie White defined culture as dependent on symbolism. Culture consists of tools, implements, utensils, clothing, ornaments, customs, institutions, belief, rituals, games, works of art, language, etc. So language is one example of our symbols in our culture. So for White, culture began when people acquired the ability to use symbols, signs that have no necessary or natural connection with things for which they stand. Culture is shared. Culture is not really an attribute of an individual, but of individuals as members of groups. So what this is saying is basically one person can't have their own culture. It's transmitted in a society, and a society is a group of people. So in this class, depending on which class you're taking for me, we could be talking about world cultures, And really we're talking about societies across the globe and their cultures. So the cultures aren't necessarily the people, it's with the way the people believe, act, and relate in their society. So each person in a society learns their culture from observing, listening, talking, and interacting with many other people. And a shared cultural background is a powerful thing. We are most likely to socialize with people who share our social, economic, and cultural backgrounds. So let's contrast culture and nature for a minute. Culture shows people how to interact with their environment in order to survive and thrive. For example, every person has to eat, and it's a biological instinct. But how, where, when, and what do we eat? These questions probably depend on our culture. Our culture and cultural changes affect ways in which we perceive nature, human nature, and the natural. So some people might think it's natural to eat horse meat, and some people might not. That is dependent on a person's culture. Culture interacts with our biology and with our environment or habitat in many other ways. So if you are studying cultural anthropology, that's of course what we're going to be focusing on is culture. But if you're taking biological anthropology, you will eventually end up looking at how our culture can actually change our biology and our environment and our habitat and even our evolution. So within the different fields of anthropology that you learned about previously, including biological anthropology, cultural, linguistic, archaeology, and applied anthropology, these are all interconnected, and we will often find crossroads between biology and culture in all of the fields of anthropology. So it's going to keep creeping up in one way or another. I mentioned how biology or how culture affects biology, but of course our biology can affect our culture. Okay, one thing I like to say about anthropology, and it's not necessarily in the previous definitions we looked at, it was in my definition of anthropology from lesson 1. I define anthropology as the all-encompassing study of humanity. So we're coming back to that concept for a second. So culture includes every aspect of culture, from selfies to a symphony. It doesn't distinguish within anthropology between high culture and what people call sometimes low culture or pop culture. Anthropologists include all of it. So every aspect of culture, even nicknames, slang language, like trends, things that go viral. We include all of those and often find them just as interesting as other aspects of what some people might consider high culture. So this concludes part 2 on culture. Please proceed to culture part 3.